Aggie Sports Report. I'm your host, Avishai Sol, and you may be wondering why I didn't walk in like I usually do. Usually I walk in through the side, or come up through the floor, jump down from the ceiling, something dramatic like that. Well, I wanted to stay sitting for this because I'm not actually wearing pants. I have them, but I'm not wearing them. You may be wondering, why aren't you wearing pants? Well, I actually just woke up here in a daze. It was, last thing I remember, I was sipping some tea with the cast of Entourage, and I just woke up under this table, and, now we're gonna talk about the world of sports. With a little segment I did a while back, but I have some more to talk about. It's my grumpy old man segment, if you will, and I call it my sports pet peeves. Things about the sports world, whether it be pickup, professional, or viewing experiences that just rub me the wrong way, grind the gears, and make me feel like a big old pile of sadness. But, of course, I have to preface with saying that I love sports, I love consuming them, and I will not have such negative things be attached to my name. So, preface, all of this comes from a place of love. That said, I hate when people who aren't real fans of teams wear sports apparel. Hats, shirts, jerseys. It doesn't even need to be people from the city. You see not real Leafs, Raptors, Blue Jays fans, they're walking around in their gear because they live in Toronto, right? But the kind that really bothers me is the people who are wearing sports gear from teams that aren't even in the city. And it's always the big marquee franchises, Lakers, Yankees, Patriots, Cowboys, Warriors, what have you. And you see them in their Yankee hats and you're like, there's just no way you're either from New York or a Yankees fan. There's just no way. That's annoying. Another sports pet peeve of mine is when the big guys flop. Now, a lot of people complain about flopping, and rightly so. It's annoying and acting and cheap, and it's sort of trying to cheat the sports system to win games, but I don't actually mind it in all cases. Most famously, guys like Lionel Messi, Kyle Lowry, Chris Paul, small guys flopping to sort of gain the advantage, and I don't mind that, because when you're at that size, you need to use every trick in the book, because you just don't have the advantages other players have. So that's why I want to specify this pet peeve of mine as not flopping, but when big guys flop. Most notably, one Joel Embiid, the 7 foot, maybe 7'2", 280-pound center for the Philadelphia 76ers, has gotten very good at cheating the refs and selling foul calls against him. Now, he's used that to much success. He's one of the top 3 candidates to win MVP and is currently leading the Sixers to one of their best seasons in years. But it bothers me whenever he flops, even more than when his teammate James Harden flops. Because James Harden is a guard, and although he's a big guard and it's annoying, whatever, he's still a guard, and use your tricks. Tricks are how you get good at the sport when you're a guard. But Joel Embiid is 7'2" and 285 pounds. He's the biggest, baddest guy in the league, and when he's flopping all over the floor and acting like he just got shot, it's a little cheaper and it's a little more annoying. Some more pet peeves real quick. The guys in pickup sports who don't know how much to care. I say that because there are some guys who care too much and are making everything annoying for everybody else because they're trying to call bullshit fouls or trying to be too aggressive or whatever. Like, you're not a pro, relax. Or the guys who don't care enough and are just goofing off and ruining the competition for everyone else. You gotta find that middle ground. It's not hard, but you gotta find it. Another thing I don't like, players asking for reviews. They're doing it too much. I don't actually mind the reviews because every once in a while refs get calls wrong. Shocker. The review thing, the players, they're doing it after every single call, and they don't even understand half the time that the team doesn't have a review because they used it earlier in the half. Quit it with the review thing. It's too much. 2 more pet peeves. First of which, the wave. I don't like the wave. It's annoying. It goes on too long, and it's rarely good. I've been to games, we're doing the wave around. Baseball has actually got it the best, baseball and football. But the wave in Raptors and Leafs games is sort of lame, and the arenas are too vertical, so you can't even, like, it comes around too often, and you can't even really see it because it's not like a thing. I don't like the wave. And the last pet peeve I have hits a little home for me, but it's when former athletes join the media and stay in the media when they're not even good. And I understand you're trying to market yourself as a media company, you want to get the biggest names you can, and these athletes do attract a crowd because it's easier to have somebody like Chris Webber on who may or may not be good than just some unknown media member who has a lot to say but isn't a recognizable name. I get the way the marketing works, but at the same time, a lot of these guys are not great. That's it. And that takes us very well into our next segment bit, which is the NBA MVP race. Currently, it's a tight race as we come down this final stretch of the NBA season with superstars Nikola Jokic, Joel Embiid, Giannis Antetokounmpo leading the charge. Now, this was going to be a close race from the beginning. Lots of MVP years have runaway favorites or maybe two guys in the front, but it's rare that we have a three-way race as close as this year's is. Many of these players are having incredible statistical seasons, and Jokic, Giannis, and Embiid have been at the top of everyone's lists really since the beginning. All deserving, all I could see winning it, and it's honestly just fun to have a debate about it. It's more interesting than having a runaway favorite because then you don't even have to talk about it, and if you are, then you just sound like an idiot. But here's where controversy was brought into this debate, and where it became more than just a friendly comparing of credentials and stats and what most valuable even means. When ESPN's Kendrick Perkins started talking about Nikola Jokic's MVP candidacy. Now, Perk is a former NBA player, a former center who played most notably with the championship Boston Celtics in the 2000s. Perk has made a reputation for himself in the media as being the guy who just says what he thinks. He's sort of following the Charles Barkley lane on that. And I respect that from an entertainment standpoint, but I think he overstepped on this one. Jokic has won the last two MVPs because of his incredible play. Statistically, he's an incredible passer. He's led his team to success, possibly beyond what the roster was capable of, and has been just a superstar player all around. He hasn't won a championship, which is notable, so you got to take that into account when looking at this year, maybe even winning his third straight MVP, because just historically, if you have three straight MVPs and no rings, it looks a little weird. But this is what Perk said. Perk looked back at some of the other players who have won MVPs, whether that's Larry Bird, who won three straight in the 80s, or Steve Nash, who won back-to-back MVPs in the 2000s, and started to argue that maybe there was some bias in the Nikola Jokic case because he was white. It's a problem because now that Perk has mentioned it, it becomes impossible to ignore. It's the kind of thing where the prospect of a completely unbiased MVP debate has now been tossed out because Perk has brought up this thing. So you can't ignore it, because then if you're ignoring it, then sounds like you're discrediting the entire argument. But then if you invoke the argument, then you're putting unfair pressure on Jokic, who is white, but is also an incredible basketball player. Now, I don't even think Jokic should win the MVP. I think Giannis should win the MVP. But what's frustrating about this is that through invoking this potential bias, unfounded or otherwise, we've inserted it into the conversation in a way that can no longer be ignored, which means that it's going to be a factor however things play out. Next, we're going to move on to the results of the Jon Jones fight. I talked a little bit about this last week, but I wasn't able to talk about the results, which were as spectacular as I think any of us could have hoped for. Just a brief recap. MMA superstar Jon Jones was making his return to the octagon after several years away from the fighting game and several years of controversy for his out-of-ring antics. Now, Jon Jones is sort of universally recognized as one of the top 2, 3, maybe one greatest MMA fighters in the history of the sport. But with a fighter of that level of greatness, there's very little margin for error. And with this recent hiatus and him sort of on and off with the controversy, what have you, people were wondering if he could still do it like he used to. He'd also put on weight. He was going up from light heavyweight to heavyweight and fighting Cyril Gane for the heavyweight championship. And he mopped the floor with him. He beat him in like 2.5 minutes by submission and just showed him superior fighting. It was almost disappointing. You would have thought that a fight with that name and this magnitude would go on for longer, give us more of a show, but like, listen, John Jones took care of business. Credit where credit is due. So here's what I want to talk about. And this brings us to our main segment of today, the greatest comebacks in the history of sports. Lots of superstar players have gone in and out of retirement, had these comeback fights, comeback games, comeback seasons, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the greatest ones. Starting with Gordie Howe, Mr. Hockey had the most insane statistical career for his sport than maybe anyone for any sport. He's sort of like the Wilt Chamberlain of hockey, just in terms of sheer quantity of statistics and tenure and years. Gordie Howe started playing in the 60s, played already a very, very long career up until 70s, mid-70s, but then he returned as a 51-year-old in the 1980 season. In that season, he scored 41 points in 80 games, which is like good. Remember, he's 51. And this isn't a non-active sport. This is a very athletic sport. To make matters even crazier, he played an exhibition game in 1997 where he was 69 years old. He held his own in professional hockey at 69. I feel like we don't talk about Gordie Howe enough. I know Gretzky's the GOAT, but Jesus, man. Another great comeback, I mentioned this guy also last week, but Georges St-Pierre. This is another one close to our hearts because Georges St-Pierre is Canadian, and in that group of 2, 3, maybe 1 greatest MMA fighters of all time, his name has to be mentioned alongside John Jones. Now, St-Pierre was a smaller fighter. He fought mostly at welterweight, but Pierre also had a hiatus from the sport and returned, became a champion. His hiatus was a little more sort of honorable. He took a lot of grievances with the use of steroids and banned substances within the MMA world and almost took a break out of protest, but he returned and had a great stretch reclaiming his title and retiring with as much grace as we've seen any fighter. Another famous comeback, and this one might be obvious, you might have seen this one coming, but Michael Jordan. He did it twice. The first time, it was great. Returning in 1995 after playing baseball for a little while, Michael Jordan would go on to lose in that first playoffs, but then after that come back and rattle off maybe the best stretch of play of his career. 1996, 7, and 8, he won championships and basically cemented his status as the greatest basketball player of all time. Another great comeback, and this guy's getting a movie soon. George Foreman. Now, George Foreman most famously was involved in another great comeback that we'll get to later, but he was a heavyweight champion in the 70s and then kept fighting, dealt with some mental health struggles, and then needed money later in life. By this point, he was old, he was bald, he was fat, and everybody was like, George, you're not the same superhuman you were as a younger fighter. Why are you even going to compete for the heavyweight title? And he's like, listen, I don't care how I look, I'm just trying to win. And George Foreman was still a really heavy hitter, and he won. He won the heavyweight title, and it was a great story because he was one of the most famous losers in the history of sport, and to have that title and that return be the end of his sports career and the end of his legacy means a lot for the way we view George Foreman. It's one of the better stories, I think, of the boxing world, and we'll see it in a movie very soon. But none of these quite hold the candle to the greatest comeback in the history of sports, which is Muhammad Ali's. A lot of these debates about the wider sports world end with that name, and his is very deserving, right? Protests the Vietnam War, is stripped of his title, comes back in spectacular fashion for the Rumble in the Jungle against George Foreman. It was called the Rumble in the Jungle because it was promoted and set in then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Maybe the greatest fight in Muhammad Ali's career. People didn't know if he could box to the same degree. People had all these questions about his commitment to the sport because, remember, at the time, his leaving was not seen as the act of honor by everyone that it is today. It was met with questions and sometimes real resentment from the wider American media. But he returns and is now facing George Foreman, a much younger and more just physically imposing fighter than he. Foreman was just like this quiet, power first puncher. Wasn't as quick as Ali, but had good footwork. And in that fight, Muhammad Ali put on just the most exquisite clinic of boxing you've ever seen. I've watched the whole fight before, but basically Ali let Foreman beat himself. He played defense. He went into the rope-a-dope, which is basically letting the guy hit you, but doing it so that you're far enough back that the punches don't have the same kind of power. So you just have to like weather this storm without getting knocked out. And the whole time Ali would do it, and he would taunt Foreman. And Foreman lost his temper, went out of control, and by the middle of the 8th round, he had punched himself out. He had worn himself out. And then Ali came off the ropes and knocked him out. It's one of the greatest storybook events in the history of sports. It's one of the more notable sort of events in American life in the 20th century. You could put it with all that. It's the crown jewel in Muhammad Ali's career. And when we're talking about comebacks, the John Jones fight looks really lame by comparison, but we can't all be Muhammad Ali. This has been the OCAD U Sports Report. My name is Avishai Saul, and I will see you all next week.